Alright, hello everyone and welcome to this webinar on Autopano Video 3. And notice here that I haven't used the Autopano Video Pro 3 because we've now merged our two versions of Autopano Video. So can everybody hear me? All right, let's start and see what happens. Let us know in the comments in the live chat if you have any issues, and we'll try to sort it out live as well as we can. Okay, perfect. So today we are going to have a look at some of the new features that we've added with Autopano Video 3. We'll go a little bit in depth into the Dwarp algorithm, and I'll show you a little bit of how it works, how you're supposed to use it, etc. So let's get started. And right off the start, you'll notice just a little redesign of our logo and this new identity that we're quite happy with. I think it looks good. And that's the only real UI change we've added to Autopano Video 3, except for that little Dwarp tab here that appeared. But we'll get back to that in a moment. So just right out of the bat, let's get some of the new features we have out of the way. And the first one is one that you won't see, but that will be very beneficial if you actually work on a PC with an NVIDIA GPU. We have optimized the CUDA optimization, CUDA rendering engine, and we've added we've worked quite hard to make them work better. And this means that we have up to a 5 times faster preview when using NVIDIA GPU on a PC, and up to 3 times faster renderings. So this is going to be really nice for everybody who is working on a PC and working with NVIDIA GPUs. The next feature I'm going to show you a little bit. We've added a lot of timecode support, and the timecode support works as well for the importing of footage and exporting of footage. So I will show you a little bit later what the export of timecode elements looks like. But I get just a little demo to show you what the import of timecode elements looks like. It's pretty straightforward, actually. So let's grab this. And here I have 2 GoPro videos. Those are just really basic side-by-side images. And those 2 were made with GoPro Hero 4 Blacks using a timecode system, Sync Pro backpack, if I'm not mistaken. And the really nice thing is that when you go into now the Synchro tab, you see that here you have the synchronization using an external clock. So since we had that timecode synchronization backpack on the cameras, we can use the timecode reference here from the cameras to synchronize. So if we click here, you see that now we have the nearest frame is frame 139, and we can just apply that, and everything is going to be updated correctly. So that's really just a brief demo, but it shows you that if you are using cameras with a synchronization module, this will work really well, and this will save you a lot of time and a lot of pain, because as we all know, using the audio or the motion to synchronize was not always the most reliable way of working. So the timecode references is a really nice addition, and is going to make workflows really faster when you are working with cameras that have some sort of timecode reference embedded in the footage. Next up, we have added a few elements for the preview. So let me close this. No, I don't want to save the changes. And let's grab some footage here. So this is footage shot on the Omni. I'm just gonna go straight here in the middle, go for the stitch, and I'm just gonna use a stitch at current position, just a very basic stitch. Because that was shot on the Omni, I obviously don't have to go through the synchronization. Now you even see that when Autopano recognized that this is an Omni shot, you see that the synchronization tab is actually grayed out. You cannot access it. So Omni just has an absolutely precise to the pixel synchronization. Timecode synchronization is going to be precise to the frame and should not drift depending on the quality of the timecode system you are using. So here we have our preview window. And if I click here on apply, we've added something that's been requested for quite some time, and that's really useful. We've added the ability to display the stitch lines right in the preview window. And what this is really nice for is that it allows you to really look at the stitch lines, because we all know that this is where the problems happen. So you can now really have a look at the stitch lines and see exactly where you might have some problems. So this is a pretty straightforward display, but I feel it is a very nice touch. Now, in terms of preview, we've also added the GoPro VR player preview. So to use that, you first need to do a little something with the GoPro VR player. So let me grab my GoPro VR player 3.0 beta. So it's right here. And now if I go into the preferences, and I go into advanced, I need to enable shared memory here. And now I'm going to restart. And now if I go into Autopano Videos 3, I click on GoPro VR Player Preview, and you see that I have my preview right here. And obviously this is all able to do live, so I can really check out what's happening here in real time. I can zoom in and zoom out to go to little planet, and obviously this is also compatible with headsets, so it's really all the features you would expect from the GoPro VR player, but you have access to it in real time without having to do any rendering, any exporting, anything. So it's a really, really nice feature that we now have in Autopano Video 3. Remember that after using this feature, to go back into the preferences, go back to advanced, and turn off the shared memory setting, so that you can now use again the VR player as usual. And the final thing I'm just going to talk about really quickly is that we've partnered up with the Foundry, and we have worked with them to make sure that those of you who were using Autopano Video Pro, but as well as Nuke, you now have a fully integrated workflow, because Nuke can now read project files from Autopano Video. So that means that you can do your quick stitches, your roughs, and your dailies in Autopano video, and for those shots that need some more work, maybe need some advanced compositing, you can grab those shots from Autopano without having to render. You can put them into Nuke and in Cara VR, and you can use the distortions, etc., that you have computed in Autopano video. You can use them in Nuke with their own then optical flow algorithms and all the compositing tools that you have at your disposal in Nuke. So this is really a major advancement, I think, for these advanced users out there who needed to have Autopano video integrated into a more fully professional workflow. So now let's get to our big subject, right? So that's Dwarp. So how exactly do you use Dwarp and what is it? So Dwarp is, I know that some of the devs who might be listening here will not agree with me, but Dwarp is a sort of optical flow solution. But instead of doing some analysis across the full images, we are doing some analysis in a very specific way, really focusing on the stitch lines and the overlapping areas based on our knowledge of distortions and based on our knowledge of stitching. We are able to do that in a more efficient manner. Dwarp is now compatible with any rig starting from 3 cameras and up. There's no upper limitation. You don't need to have an Omni. You don't need to have a pixel accurate synchronization system. You can have a traditional synchronization with the clap. You can use those Freedom 360s and all of those non-synchronized rigs. You can use those. You can as well use obviously those 3-4 camera rigs with antenna lenses or Isuga lenses. All of those rigs work really well. It's the footage I'm going to show you the Dwarp with is going to be Omni footage because that's the camera we work with the most here. But obviously everything I'm going to show you is going to be compatible with everything else. So no, Diego, to answer your question, Dwarp is not only for Omni. It's really for all type of cameras, and that was really important for us to support any camera with 3 or more cameras. We don't support back-to-back rigs. So how exactly do you use it? Well, the idea is that the warp is going to be that really last step. I've seen some people who've talked about their experience with Autopano Video 3 and with the Omni or with other rigs, and especially with the Omni, I've seen people talking about the fact that they warped their footage in the Omni importer. It can be useful in some cases if you know exactly what part of the footage you're going to be using and you really want that warping done automatically and you don't want to be working at all on the footage. But ideally, the warp is really going to be that last step, and is going to be the one that maybe you're not using all the time. And there's a very good reason for that. It's because the warp algorithm, the warp computing and rendering footage that has been warped is going to be pretty time consuming. It's resource heavy. It requires quite a lot of processing power. So if you start rendering and warping everything and warping the entire footage all the time, this is obviously going to cost you a lot of time. So the idea is really the same way we were doing before with template stitching, when you were just rendering some quick stitches, quick renders in MP4s, and then doing like your full res renders only when you knew what you were going to be using in your timeline in Premiere for your final experience. This is really the same approach that you need to have with the warping. It's doing your renders, MP4 basic template renders, using those to create your story, create your edit in Adobe Premiere or in Final Cut or in whatever NLE software you're using. And then once you're sure what you're going to be using, then starting to use the warping for those shots that don't work with templates. It's really one more tool in your box. It's not a killer solution that you should use all the time. It's really one more tool that you have at your disposal. So in terms of using it, so because this is really the approach we want to use, and because the warping needs to have some very specific information to be able to work well, the idea is really to start with your completely traditional workflow that you've been using with AVP2 for the past 2 years. So you're going to be stitching, sometimes stitching just as current position, sometimes stitching as current selection. You're going to also compute your color. So let's just apply a color to a full state. Now that's starting to look better. You're going to make sure that you are in sharp blending mode. If you're going to be using the warp, you can see that if I select smooth and I apply, parallax compensation and mask are not available. So if you see that parallax compensation is grayed out, it's either that you are using a 2-camera rig or that you are actually in smooth blending. So you just need to go back to sharp blending. And so you have color, you have blend, and then stabilization. Stabilization, I'm just gonna touch a little bit on that. The stabilization is something you should do before you are going to warp. I'm not gonna do it for that shot because basically we don't want to spend some time just watching a progress bar move forward. So I'm just going to leave it be. But if you are computing the motion, do it before you are doing the warp, especially when you are working with the Omni, because the Omni also you can enable the rolling shutter compensation. If you have already warped some footage and you decide to use the rolling shutter compensation, you are going to have to recompute all the warp. The rolling shutter compensation needs a specific warping process, so it's not going to be valid. The warp is not going to be valid if you are using then the rolling shutter correction. And also note that the rolling shutter correction with the Omni for warping is really extremely costly in terms of time and computing power. Because each frame has to be individually treated, then warped. So it's a very lengthy process. So use it sparely. Make sure that you are using it only in the cases that absolutely require it. Something like shots from an helicopter, like with really lots of speed and vibrations and a lot of artifacts, then the rolling shutter compensation is going to be a very good tool to make those shots look better. And for some shots, you also even still need to go into Autopano Giga and work on those control points, because the warping, for something, let's take this example. Basically, for the warping, the warp is going to be able to match those two elements. For example, here, the warp is going to be able to fix that, but it might have to distort this bar, and so it might have to actually just move those things and bend them to match them, and you might sometimes see therefore some sort of like straight lines that start to appear weirdly bent, and that's really one of the elements that the warp is not going to be able to do magic on those if you start from a bad situation. So that's why you want to have a stitch that's as good as possible, as close to perfect as possible, and the warp is really going to be that last step that is going to touch up on and put the finishing touches on everything that you have in your footage. But I'm not going to be working on this one, and we're going to be using the warp right now to see how much of it can save, because here the camera was probably 25 to 30 centimeters over the car, so you have a lot of things really close to the camera, a lot of things far away as well. We have this guy that's like 40 centimeters away from the camera with like a stitch line right in the middle of his head. So let's see how well the warping is going to work on this. And because I don't want this to last 2 hours, we're going to be using warping just a second of footage, especially because this was shot at 120 frames per second. So, come on. And this is going to be my out point. I'm going to press F to make my selected area the same size as my render area. And now I'm going to go into the Dwarp. And you see that now with that latest release candidate version of Autopano Video, we have 3 different settings, and I will go over them while we are computing the warp here. But for this one, I'm going to use prioritize space, which is the default. So yeah, basically the bulging effects, where the parallax waves, this is what I call some wobble. Here you see that you have time windows. I'm gonna explain that a little bit. So let me grab my infos. Okay, so you see that you have 3 different modes. The first one is called prioritize space, and you also see here when you are warping that it's talking about something called time windows. So let me explain a little bit how that works and what's the difference between those 3 different modes. Okay, is the sound back? It should be back by now. All right, sorry about that. So let's get back to our explanations. All right. Okay, glad to be back. So, all right. So you can see that here, what we're looking at right now, here we have this prioritize space window. So each of those squares is a frame, right? This is the representation of something like 45 frames or 40 frames. When you are using prioritize space, the time window is composed of 5 frames, and there's an overlap between each of the time windows that is just 1 frame. So what exactly does that mean? Well, the time window is a group of frames that the algorithm is going to analyze and is going to try to find one solution to parallax issue that it can apply to each of those 5 frames. So basically it's a mini template, the same way that before you would have your stitch timeline and you could create different states of stitching. You can see a time window as one state of stitching. But it's a little bit more tricky than that. So when you are using prioritize space, you see that you have 1 frame of overlap between each of the time windows. So what we're doing when we have our first time window that's being computed, you're going to have 5 frames selected. You're going to look at those 5 frames. You're going to find a solution for parallax issues on those 5 frames and apply it to the 5 frames. And then you're going to be switching only to 4 frames. So that's what you see here in that drawing, is that you have, let's say, now we have computed the first time window. We've applied the stitch to only 4 of those 5 frames. And the 5th one remembers what solution was used for the first time window, but is also included in the second time window. That means that that frame is computed twice. The algorithm looks at it twice. And the solution that was applied in the first time window is going to weigh in on what the software can do to fix parallax issues in the second time window, etc., etc. So the next time window would also include the last frame of the time window number 2, etc., etc., etc. So what this means is that we basically create an individual solution, an individual way of fixing parallax every 4 frames. And so this is really interesting when you have your camera that is moving, when you have a lot of activity in the seams, in the stitch lines, because that means that every 4 frames the software will readapt to a new situation. So you're gonna have a very nimble parallax compensation. But this also means that if you have a lot of changes and then you're going to start seeing some warping artifacts, basically. So you can see sometimes when you have a strong movement in one of the stitch lines, you can see maybe the background start wobbling a little. You can have this sort of jello effect that is really typical of those warping algorithms in every software that uses it. So how do you deal with those kind of effects? Well, that's why we have also some different, some other settings. And typically, if you are experiencing something like that, if you are experiencing some wobbles inside your stitch lines, you can try using the prioritize time. Prioritize time. With prioritize time, basically the time window is just bigger. It's now it's 30 frames instead of 5. So when you're shooting at 30 frames per second, obviously you're looking like each second has its own unique parallax solving option. So that's really going to make the algorithm less responsive, less reactive. But it's also going to correct a lot of those wobbling and sort of jello effects that you can start seeing when you are using the Dwarp algorithm. And there's also something else. We explain in the Dwarp tab in AV3 that prioritized time is slower. That's because not only is each time window bigger, so you have to analyze 30 frames for each of those time windows, but we also have a way bigger overlapping area for the algorithm. Basically, when you are computing a time window, you are looking at 30 frames, then applying that solution to 20 frames, and the last 10 frames are also included in the next time window. You have 10 frames of overlap between two time windows. This means that those 10 frames will be computed twice. And that means that for every 30 frames, you are computing twice 10 of those 30 frames. So this is why the algorithm is way slower, even if we were to use prioritized time in the example I showed you, you would have less time windows than you had with prioritized space, because, well, here for something like a little over 30 frames, we have only two time windows, when with our space example we would have had something like 6 time windows. So that's the difference between prioritized time and prioritized space. So these are still pretty responsive warping algorithm, but sometimes you want to have the benefits of the parallax compensation. You want to have the benefits of that ability to distort a little more your footage, but you really don't need or want the warping to be adjusted all the time. And this is where our third parallax compensation mode goes into play. So this is still, and for still, basically you'll see there's no question of time windows. For still, it's just the software will take 5 frames and just find the solution for the parallax situation, the parallax issues in those 5 frames, and we'll apply that to your entire selected area. So it really means that you have a you have a way faster solution, and you can still compensate something. But it also means that if none of those 5 frames maybe you have somebody in your image that's going to cross some stitch lines. If none of those 5 frames had that person in them, well, that means that the warping is probably not going to work on that person. So you're back basically to a template stitching solution, the same kind of the same way you would have with the classic stitching when you were using Autopano Video 2.6. It's just that the algorithm has helped you deal with some of those parallax issues, and that means that you can have some elements that are way closer to your camera that will be much better. And talking about that, let's go back to my screen. And you can see that here with the prioritized space, if I go back to my previous element, you can see that the prioritized space did a pretty good job of fixing that shot. So we had, earlier we had, these things were pretty far away, the logo was completely cut, his face was completely distorted, and now we have a pretty good element. But you can see what I was talking about is that this was initially a straight line. Let's open that in the VR player. And here you can see what I was talking about is that this used to be this should be a straight line, but because there was such a gap between the two elements, because I had not done any work on this thing previously, well, you see that the software did what it could to fix the problem, which means that it bent here, that straight line. It also bent it here, just to find a way to match the content of those two images. And that's really what it is doing. When you are experimenting issues, when you are experimenting issues, sometimes just working a little bit on the original stitch and doing it going for it with Autopano Giga and control points will often save you quite a lot of time. But if we go back here and play, come on, you can see like the you can see the type of work that the warping is able to do. So you're already saving quite a lot of you're saving quite a lot of work. So Ralph, so prioritize time should be used in small time windows. Well, I mean, it's just gonna take longer to compute. There's no real limitation that telling you. I'm not gonna tell you that it should not be used for more than X second or X frames. There's no real limitation on that. It's just that you have to factor in the fact that it's gonna take a little bit longer to compute and to render than prioritize space. And depending on the version, I mean, we are still, don't remember that this is still a release candidate version. So what this means, the RC1 version, this means that this is an option, a version that has a feature lock. So we're not going to be adding new features, or we're not going to be changing anything major. But RC1 is not a final version. So we have actually been working quite a bit on prioritized time, because the initial release we had was not working entirely as we wanted it to work. So it's gonna get better with time. That's for sure. We are still fine-tuning the algorithms and fine-tuning the software and the way it's integrated. So that's really important for you guys who use Autopano Video 3 out there, especially during this release candidate phase. Please upload all the bug reports. Please go on the forum and tell us when you are experiencing troubles, because if those are problems that with the software in itself, this is something we are going to be able to fix before we release the absolute final version. So that might be one of the explanation why your prioritized time footage, Ralph, was not working as well as expected. And again, the warping is not a silver bullet. It's not magic. It's an algorithm, and it doesn't make entirely of the past. I mean, when you have two cameras looking at an object, you have to have parallel. You're going to have two different point of view. It's really a question also of some things won't be corrected, and typically you can see here on the example I have that you have here the antenna of the car. Even if I go back to my warped moment, you can see that the antenna cannot be fixed, and like for something like that, there's really no real absolute fixes. This is something you would need to remove in post and to work with in post. Or maybe for that shot, actually, you would also do a render in Sharp and use some masks to sort of mask out the antenna, and just use that part in the footage, while using for everything else using the warped image. Warping is making everything easier. It's making everything faster. It is not a magic trick. It is not solving physics or optics. We're still confined to the laws of optics, and parallax is part of those laws. Boris, if you want to play with AV3, you can always download the demo. I mean, the demo version has absolutely no limitations in terms of how you can use it. The only limitations are in terms of rendering. You can render a maximum of 30 seconds, and the renders will be watermarked. But if you want to play with the software and have a look at it, please do it and have a look at it. It's just you can use the demo, and you just are going to be limited in what you can render with it. But if it's just to explore what the software does and how it works, the demo version has absolutely no limitation. So you can just go onto kolor.com, and when you're going to have the prompt to enter your serial number, you can say that you want to keep using the demo version, and it's going to work just fine. Good, and grab the software and so just to finish with you, Ralph, for the three options, for me, prioritize space if you have a moving camera, basically something that's going to be, for a camera that's going to be mounted maybe on a bike, maybe mounted like just any moving camera, especially fast moving camera. Prioritize space is going to be the real way to go, because you're going to have new situations, especially if you're like on something that moves fast. You're going to have new situations all the time, so you're always going to be able to adapt really quickly to all the parallax changes. And if you do some testing, you're going to see that it can adapt to, you can go pretty close to some objects. It's going to be able to adapt to that really fast, and then you go out into an open space, and suddenly, boom, really quickly you're going to have a stitch that is completely adapted to that space. So this is really, prioritize space is really the option for those kind of situations. Prioritize time, actually, for a situation like